Great. Well, we are at the hour. I want to say good morning or good afternoon for those of you on the East Coast, and welcome to our seminar today. My name is Nancy Easterbrook. I'm Executive Director of Silicon Valley Directors Exchange. Today's session, the title is The Ticking Time Bomb of Compromised and Exploited Employees, Why Technical Cybersecurity Isn't Enough. We are delighted to have you joining us today. I want to send a special thank you to our panelists for their time and their participation. I will do very brief introductions before handing it off to Dan. Beatrice Infante is an award-winning public and private company board director and former four-time CEO. She is currently Chief Executive Officer of Business Acceleration, LLC. Ms. Infante has served on the board of directors of various companies and is currently on the boards at PriceSmart, Ribbon Communications, and Liquidity Services, Incorporated. Mr. William Priestap is a recognized thought leader in national security with a particular expertise in the growing threats posed by certain foreign nations, especially Russia and China. He was the Assistant Director of the FBI Counterintelligence Division from 2015 to 2018 and was responsible for all aspects of the FBI's counterintelligence mission. Ray Rothrock is Chairman and CEO of Red Seal Incorporated, an enterprise cybersecurity company. Mr. Rothrock is an invited speaker on venture capital, startup companies, cybersecurity, nuclear energy, climate change, and energy policy in general. Holden Triplett is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service. He led the FBI office in Beijing from 2014 to 2017 and was deputy head of the FBI office in Moscow from 2012 to 2014. Our moderator for today, Daniel Siciliano, is a successful technology CEO, founder, and entrepreneur. He is currently chairman of the board of the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco, chairman of SVDX, and a fellow at Stanford University. Today's session will be 60 minutes long. We welcome you to submit your questions via the Q&A feature on Zoom, and I will pass the baton off to Dan.
Thanks, Nancy. We'll dive right in. So this isn't your average cybersecurity webinar from last year or the year before. This is a really different topic, and we'll keep this quite conversational, but I think as an kind of opening question, I do want each of the panelists to talk about what it is exactly that we are talking about. So I think it's something that a lot of us are aware of, but we're referring mainly to the non-cybersecurity component, though inevitably technology is often involved in the stories that we'll tell and the things that we're going to talk about, but the non-cybersecurity side of information security. So what does that mean? What area are we focusing on? And then I'll probably have some follow-up questions about, what are the gaps in light of this differential and different type of risk? Maybe Ray, if you're willing, I might have you kind of kick it off and then go to Holden and then Beatrice, and I'm gonna make Bill give us some hard actual examples, but maybe give us a sense of what are we talking about if we're not talking about the cybersecurity thing we're constantly obsessing about these last few years.
Well, good morning, and thank you for having me here, Dan. And hello, everybody, my fellow panelists. So, information has become the lifeblood of our system, our economy, our world. The world is rapidly becoming digitized. And so if you're not on the network, you're really not in the business much anymore. And so it's really essential. And it's all about the data. We can only do so much about data because there are 7 billion people and most of them have access to the internet and data, and they work in places. So what we're talking about here is people. And people are very dynamic. Their lives change, their stresses change, they get married, they get divorced, they have children, there's deaths in their family. It's just situations can change for people. And so you have to really be aware of what you have that's sensitive and how your people are behaving, acting, and responding to the stresses in their lives. That's not always easy. So cyber, I'll put cyber in air quotes there, becomes as much a psychological game and an HR management game as it does become a technology game. And that's principally what we're going to talk about today, how all that impacts. It's not a one and done thing. It's a constant learning and a constant observation.
Great. And, we don't often invoke the phrase or the word espionage in our, sessions at SVDX, but that's going to be a piece of what we talk about. And certainly cybersecurity invokes that concern. But maybe let me shift to Beatrice and maybe talk your experience both as a CEO and a board member. Of course, Ray is as well. But maybe can you frame it for us in terms of what this means for boards? Like, what is the topic that we need to, make room for to address? We have this human element and kind of this, people issue that Ray highlights, but what does it mean when a board talks about the non-cybersecurity information security issues that might manifest?
Great. Thanks, Dan. So, sort of stepping back a little bit, boards, every board today has some cybersecurity, some committee dedicated to cybersecurity. Usually it's audit, et cetera. And then they may review it at the board level. The thing to understand, though, is that this is a very complex issue and it overlaps the compensation committee and your human capital management. How are you hiring your employees? How are you training them? How are you monitoring any illegal activity that they may be undertaking, whether it's known or unknown to them, right? They may be a victim of a phishing attack, et cetera. And there's also governance issues. So it really needs to be treated as a holistic approach. And what I found to be the most helpful is to look from the outside into the company and its people, at the people who are going to be perpetuating any kind of threat to your company. And those fall in separate buckets with a lot of different motivations. So there's cyber criminals. Their goal is money. That's very straightforward. There's also nation states, which could be looking for sensitive information, not necessarily about your company, but about the general industry, about companies that you're related to. And obviously as well, hacker activists. If you're in a company that say is in the oil industry, you may find yourself disproportionately a target for people who are concerned about, the safety of the environment. So you need to understand the motivations of the sets of people who could be targeting your company, because then that modifies how you look at your employees. Do you have employees that are, particularly vocal about, the company's green footprint? Maybe just make sure they have extra training to understand their security requirements and so on. So it's a very useful exercise for the company to go through and understand who might target them, and then feed that inward to who might be sympathetic or who might be duped into helping someone on the outside.
So it sounds like the threat landscape assessment is very similar and compatible to the way in which we think about cybersecurity. It just sounds like it's a slightly wider lens. And it also sounds like the activation of the risk or the threat also is similar in that it can be inside, it can be external. But maybe if I'm discerning correctly, the focus is less about cyber intrusion and more about understanding, situations and scenarios in which information or intellectual property or just operations of the company are at risk because of some sort of negative bad actor action. And so that maybe brings me to Holden, which is, we heard mention of it about, people both being a tremendous asset, but also this kind of a vulnerability. Could you expand on the way in which we should be thinking about this non-cybersecurity threat vis-a-vis people, the professionals inside organizations, and maybe if you, I hope you'll mention the duality of it, which is on the one hand, you might think of individuals as a threat, but that seems like a terrible way to think about your employees. So maybe help frame that for us as well.
Sure. Well, good morning, everyone. I think you're hitting on something that's particularly important, and Beatrice and both Ray kind of mentioned this as well, is that I think focusing purely on cybersecurity at times, you're only looking at the particular methodology they might be to get into an IT system. But ultimately, it's not really telling you a lot about the group that's on the outside that's orchestrating this, right? And so one of the things that Bill and I have written a lot about is that oftentimes, and more often today, you find that being a nation state, and the vehicle they use or the tool they use is an intelligence service. And so focusing purely on the cybersecurity portion of it, you may see which particular sort of zero-day flaw they might be exploiting. but ultimately it doesn't always tell you what are they after, why are they trying to get it, and ultimately how are they going to use that information potentially against your company in order to advance their state interests. And so I think it's important to take this kind of holistic approach and think about who was on the outside and not just the one particular avenue of cybersecurity that they might come at you to get your information, but what else is out there, right? And again, you mentioned the idea that employees are in this particularly precarious position. There's a lot of talk of insider threat programs, and I really think that's the wrong way to think about this. No one wants to think about their employees as threats. And the reality is the vast majority of them aren't. But a lot of them can be put into very vulnerable positions, right? Because either they have familial or financial connections, sometimes back to a country that is an authoritarian regime. Well, there's all sorts of things that happen in their life that, as we've mentioned, maybe they're having financial difficulties or difficulties within their family relationships, but they can put them in a vulnerable position. And so they are essentially kind of occupy this, as you mentioned, strange duality of being an extremely vulnerable population, but at the same time being your greatest asset. Because if you want to think about where is the information really contained, sure, you've got valuable IP that's going to be contained on your IT systems. But for many companies, who generated that? Your employees, right? Or a team of employees. They generated these really incredible, either algorithms or pieces of intellectual property that are being used by it. So who's more valuable, the static piece of information or the actual producer of that information? So people really need to think about, and this is how nation states and their intelligence services are thinking about it. They get at those people and they're the generator of their ideas.
That's great. And I think we're going to come back to that. This idea of the theft of the output of your capacity of the company is obviously a bad thing, but the theft of the actual capacity to produce important things is even worse. And that, so at least for me, when we talked about this, that was a new frame for me. And I think it's helpful to think about it that way. And we'll come back to that. But Bill, I hope maybe what you can do is give us some very specific, examples of, now we have kind of the lay of the land here, but what does that look like in reality? Because by the way, the follow-up question, which I'll bring next, is going to be, okay, like I'm the director of a mid-sized manufacturing company. My company is neither sexy nor big. Like, should I really care? It's cool to talk about, but should I really care? But first, let's maybe hear from Bill about real examples. Then I'll have everyone weigh in on the why everybody, I think, should care.
Sure, Dan. And again, thanks for having me and the rest of us here today. I'm happy to provide a couple brief examples, but before I do, really the most important thing I want to convey is this is happening all the time. A lot of people might not be paying attention to it. Holden and I do, because it's what we care about. But the fact that I'm providing a couple of examples, just know it's happening again and again and again and again. But real quickly, let's take just last year. An associate research scientist at a large oil company was charged by the federal government with stealing proprietary information. There was no cyber intrusion, there's no hack. He simply used his employee access to access the information he wanted and took it. Now, what was he going to do with it? He had actually accepted a job with a Chinese rival of the US company he was working for and stole from. And oh, by the way, what he stole was worth over $1 billion, meaning the research, according to the US company. But again, no cyber intrusion whatsoever. Used his employee access, took what he wanted and was planning to go overseas. That easy. Another one in 2019, a Coca-Cola employee. Coca-Cola, along with a lot of other companies, are doing a lot of research into BPAs, which I'm not a scientist, but it's my understanding it's a chemical that helps harden and protect plastic containers. But there's some health risks associated with BPAs, so everybody's trying to find a healthier version of BPAs. So Coca-Cola doing a bunch of research on this. An employee uses their employee access, again, no cyber hack, no intrusion whatsoever, and basically takes the BPA research from Coca-Cola. What was she going to do with it? She had set up with some others a company in China in which she was going to further develop this, the concept she was stealing, what have you. It's my understanding that Coca-Cola valued that research at well over $120 million. And again, guys, I could go on and on with examples, but it's just employees using their regular access to take what they want, and they intend to use it to compete against the very companies they're taking from. Last thing I want to mention, though, is often companies have mechanisms in place to learn about the wrongdoing after it happened, but in effect, they're not preventing the thefts from occurring in the first place. And that to me is the big issue.
So I think most of us are familiar with like the SolarWinds incident. And I think we put that typically in the box of a cybersecurity risk. And, if you've been paying attention for a long time, the big kickoff to a lot of cybersecurity awareness was the Target hack. And in between then and now, we have lots of incidents, but most of them seem to be about big companies, even Bill, your example, Coca-Cola, giant energy companies. And they also seem to be about this either rogue employee theft of something, or oftentimes a nation state actor. Now, one question we're going to have is, where do those come together, and why do we care about that? But maybe the first question I should ask is, why should the average company care? So what if you're 1/1000th the size of Coca-Cola? What if you're not in a sexy sector, which is, you're not consumer facing, you're not energy, you're just kind of out there doing what most companies do, which is serving a particular market over time. You're not a big dominant company. Why should we care? And maybe mention, what are some of the trends that help us realize that this is arguably a threat that has very broad scope, even for smaller companies? Whoever wants to go first on that, I'm happy to have you jump in.
Well, the thing to keep in mind is that it may not just necessarily be you that's targeted, but your supply chain. I know a CEO, this is a few years back, of a public company where they had a supply chain upon which their revenue relied. and an external player, and I don't want to give too many details, targeted a particular employee who had access to information about the supply chain, not necessarily even about the company, but the other company systems were too hard to break into. They couldn't get the information they wanted, but this company, as a supply chain partner, had access through, again, firewalls and so on. But that employee was able to provide the information to the third party that then essentially froze the systems of the other company. And the original company, which was at best a remote participant, missed their revenue numbers that quarter and into the next quarter because their supply chain had just been compromised by this attack. So there are peripheral damages done, collateral damages done, even if you're not the direct target. If you're a conduit to a target, you can be impacted as well.
Got it. Ray, it sounded like you wanted.
I wonder if I look small. So, I think small companies are great targets, right? No one cares. Is it, if I steal $10,000, $100 events versus $1 million in one event, I still get $1 million. So it seems like to me, and with the ability to affect it, meaning to get people to do things. The other thing is, look, I don't know what the data says about the average time someone stays in a job, but if you find a small company that may have some employees that you think you could influence, then you could go after them and encourage them to take a job at a place which is your actual target. I think one of the things that Bill I've learned from them is that the big guys are very patient. The big bad guys, they're very patient. They have a plan, they have a strategy, and they'll go at it multiple ways to achieve it. So, and Bill's examples were where an employee was going to do some bad, take some intellectual property, start something for their own benefit. What about just the impact on people that need an extra $10,000 or $100,000? I think that's probably a bigger risk than that individual. I don't know. They've got the data, I don't. But we worry about that. When at Red Seal, we have a whole lot of training. We had a whole lot of endpoint protection capabilities that would signal us And I actually had to walk an employee to the door once because they had an emotional outburst. And we quickly huddled and said, that is a risk for the company. So we had to ask them to leave.
So Ray, I'm going to follow up on something you said. I'm going to probably throw it to Holden and Bill to expand on. And that is, you invoked the idea of very patient kind of big player bad actors. And certainly in the cybersecurity space, we worry about, nation state actors. They have tremendous capacity. There's really a fairly short list of folks we worry about on a day-to-day basis. But I wonder if that is a sort of blind spot for the average company, the average executive, the average director, which is to say the fact that the scale and scope of the operations, and particularly for authoritarian and arguably well-run autocratic regimes, their ability to engage in these sophisticated long-term schemes, which might be about, investing in intelligence over time, moving many pieces into a single, picture, using, lower hanging fruit to get to more valuable things. So this is planning that we are not certainly accustomed to assigning to cyber criminals, nor to hacktivists, but it sounds like it's the central theme of some of what you're talking about. So Holden and Bill, can you help us understand how big of a deal that is and what the trend is and what that means? So let's call it out. Like China has a industrial policy as a function of its government, and its industrial policy, I have read and been told, is about achieving competitive advantage for its enterprises, which are not arguably government, and engaging government resources, whether espionage or otherwise, to augment their competitive position within the global economy. And this is something that certainly in the United States, we are much less familiar with, because that tends not to be the pattern of our government acting. So we don't think about that. So that's what I'm getting at. Could you talk a little bit about that? And is it big? Is it small? Is it growing? How do we think about it?
Holden, please, if you want to take the first part, and I can talk more about the scope.
Sure, absolutely. So I think, Dan, this gets back to something you were mentioning before about thinking about who's on the outside, right? And what are their goals? And there's been a lot of talk about what nation states are trying to do. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of times it gets conflated in the press. And there's really two parts to this, right? Broadly speaking. There is the economic development piece, right? Which the sort of notorious now Made in China 2025, which now China says, oh, that's not accurate, and they've changed it and then sort of taken it off of multiple websites. But there's also this kind of news concept that's come up, the idea of stranglehold technologies. Don't worry about the specifics on that for this one. The concept I think people need to understand is there is a plan at the central government level in order, what are the pieces of technology that they need in order to advance their economies? That's part one, right? And that's where I think a lot of people say, well, I don't make anything that's on that list, so why would they go after me? Part two is this vast proliferation of the tools and tactics of intelligence services. And you're seeing the intelligence services supplement and assist a lot of the companies within China in terms of it's being brought into and made part and parcel of their competitive strategy. So what does that mean if you are a big financial company in China and who you might be competing with against in the United States? Well, you want to know all the little nits and details. Who are their key employees? Who is their supply chain if they have it? What are the plans and intentions for the next couple of years? How can they, what all the sort of details that most people would think, well, this is really mundane. Who wants to know that? Who wants to know that? Your competitor that's looking to steal your market share in all these places, right? So it's not just the big government that's looking for the high tech, high speed, AI, quantum computing type of things, but it can be very mundane things like, what's your plan for expansion over the next 5 years in India or something like that, right? Because they want to make sure they get ahead of you, and they're not beholden in the same way that we are by FCPA or anti-money laundering laws. They can kind of use the full gambit of resources out there in order to expand it.
And Bill, before you hop in, I want to throw something out there, because when you talk to folks who are not immersed in security or intelligence services, and you hear this, your immediate reaction is these guys are watching a little bit too much primetime television, right? It's like, I hear you, but that sounds like, but I just want to emphasize, like, you're not from the primetime television set. You're from the FBI. longtime public servant careers and in the center and at the top, frankly, of the intelligence services. So this is hands-on information. And so I do want to say that because I think the average person hearing this is like, wow, Holden's a really serious guy and he's got a thing for China, but it's well earned. Like you've earned the right to say that. So with that as a backdrop, I may ask some follow-up questions about sort of on the ground tactical manifestations of this. And I know we worry about China to a certain extent, Iran, Russia, maybe North Korea, and there's others, but when we say nation state, that tends to be our reference. So Bill, do you want to expand on Holden's analysis?
Yeah, no, and thank you. It was actually an excellent lead in. It was, as Holden kind of described how the threat, actually plays out. Let me take a second and just describe the scope of it. And I always think of it, I'm sure I talk with my hands and I wish I had a board and could write and whatnot, but the long and short of it is I think of it as three ever bigger circles. And the first small circle in the middle is what I refer to as publicly known incidents. So what I'm talking about here is economic espionage incidents targeting the US. Well, the publicly known, if you just read any regular paper news website today, you're seeing there's more and more of those publicly known incidents. Well, Holden and I, of course, spent our early careers in government. So the next biggest circle are the known incidents, but they're not public. What I'm getting at there is the things the government, where Holden and I sat, things we knew and saw every day about the scope of this threat, but for a whole variety of reasons, the government couldn't share with the general public. And so what I'm saying is that second circle, there's even more incidents than are what are publicly known about. But actually what worries us to no end is actually the third circle, which is by far the biggest of all of these. And I refer to it as the unknown or unidentified incidents, meaning the government has very limited resources. And so while it knows an awful lot, it can't cover, understand, protect all the things that need covering, understanding, and protecting. And so there's a ton the government isn't seeing and knowing about. But we know these incidents are occurring because of the fantastic advancements that some countries are having in certain areas. And the only way they can advance so greatly is if they basically skip the R&D development cycle and they stole what our companies were doing and they find ways to quickly implement it. So again, if you think of it as those three circles, that what I'm trying to convey is the scale of the problem, in my opinion, is far more prevalent. It's far bigger than people understand.
And I'm going to invoke something that Ray said in our preparation conversations. That was that the notion of relying on technology as a company, as a board, to kind of solve your problem is both naive and frankly, just not smart, right? And I'm going to, my follow-up question in a minute is going to be about the human capital side of this. I'd like to expand on the practical things that boards should be raising or talking about and what they can do, and maybe even draw some more examples about why. And I think it is a blind spot for a lot of boards, and I think there's understandable reasons why. But before we do that, I want to do a quick poll, Nancy, if you don't mind pulling up a poll. We want to get a sense of where people are spending time as boards or companies. What level of attention is a given company, whether you're on the board or the executive of that company, spending to non-cyber threat information security. So that can be the mundane, you make sure you have locks on the doors to your research labs, all the way to, have you set up HR systems for vulnerable, exploitable individuals who might be wonderful people, but may need help if something interesting happens vis-a-vis a nation state. So there's 4 choices. They are, less than quantitative in perfection, but figure they get the idea. So a lot, equal to or more than cyber, that would be a high bar, I think, these days, all the way down to none, like, oh, I didn't know we should talk about more than cyber. So let's see what people say. Give them a second. I'll let Nancy pull up the results. Let's see. What do we get? Okay. Well, all right. I suspect as a panel, this is sort of what you expected. I think we have a good crowd attending. So 15%, quite a bit. Right, that's a lot, I think, and then the vast majority are only somewhat or rarely, and then a few none. So that's kind of what we expected. So that's helpful. So let me turn the question back to this practical thing, which is, it sounds like a board of directors, and an executive team should be asking questions about oftentimes people and how you're helping and preparing and training and creating safety nets for your people. Can you expand on that? Because that's something that I don't think we talk enough about at the board level. So what does that mean in this context? I'm happy to have anybody go first.
Sure,
Ray, go ahead.
I'll jump in there, Dan. So, a board, just sidebar real quick, this governance concept, the mission of the board is to grow the company as effectively and efficiently as we can to create value for everyone involved, not just the shareholders. And that's a strong motive to do things. But unfortunately, in this world where we now have these threats that are insidious and hidden and so forth, and now people are being motivated to take technology and use it as a threat, our governance concept has to be expanded. And it's not just focusing on the expenses, it's focusing on the people in the operations. So one of the things that I have advocated on some of my boards is that you need to think more broadly about your policies. Everybody has an HR manual that's 50 pages and all this sort of stuff, but there's other policies. It's like, you should, if you see someone behaving badly, you can do a whistleblower kind of a policy in place. But the point about, I'm not going to get into a lot of detail of policy, but the point of a policy is when something occurs and it's a violation of the policy, the board or the management can say, you have violated policy. And you should think about these things before you're under fire. Because if you don't, you'll there'll be a lot of emotion involved in that decision. But if the policy is really thoughtful, and some of these crisis management firms like Brunswick and DC and stuff, they have these templates and stuff for all this. It's very important because then you can take action. And if someone does something bad or whatever, do you call the police? Do you call the FBI? I mean, we had this at Venrock. We had an employee that was in a portfolio company that was harassing us. Well, who do we call? What do you do? Now these things are in place. So I think the board has a responsibility to take it down a notch, to understand what those policies are, so that in fact on your survey it is rare. It's only when something has happened that a policy's been violated. Heck, I've been involved in boards that make things, because they always have a big sign. The first slide is, so many hours or so many things manufactured without an accident. Why can't we have a similar thing about, no malfeasance, no theft, come on. We live in a very complicated world, and boards have to step up their game and really ask management to investigate this and think broadly.
Ray, I think that's a great way to frame it, especially if you realize that the idea of getting ahead of something is where you have the most effect, often where you can mitigate the consequence the most. And that's more likely to line up with the board role anyway, right?
Yeah,
so
but boards don't like to do that. Boards like to grow the top line, not manage these sorts of other things.
Right.
But the board has to tell management, you've got to do this.
And the piece of good news here is it does sound similar to the framing that is the best practice for cybersecurity, which is decide in advance, do you or don't you respond in this way to ransomware? What is the authority of your IT? What is the repercussion of someone who fails terribly in an obvious, ransomware clickbait? Like all these things talking about in advance lets you get a little bit ahead of it, and there's professionals to help you do that. So it's not like you have to invent from a whole cloth. What else would everyone like? I'd like this part of the conversation. Maybe Beatrice, you want to throw in a little bit more about the HR side, or?
It's two things. One is what I mentioned a little bit earlier, which is making sure that all the relevant areas are covered at the committee level. So, for example, ethics training. It is a very good practice every 3 months to make every employee take, an ethics questionnaire, do a little bit of training, answer a few questions and so on, to make sure they understand their roles and responsibilities, and sprinkle that not just with, questions about cybersecurity, but questions about, security, the physical security of the organization. Do people randomly walk through the hallways and, and have access to, uncontrolled computers? On the human capital side, one very good instrument that I'm aware of that has been used very successfully is every company should be conducting an annual employee engagement survey. Now, normally that's just meant to say, to have a net promoter score that's positive, et cetera. But you can sprinkle in a number of questions in there, which are meant to identify in a fairly, subtle way, have you become aware of any situation where employees are very unhappy with the company to the extent that they might want to harm, cause some harm, even if it's minor, right? So if you ask those kinds of questions sprinkled in amongst the other questionnaire, you're much more likely to get a response, particularly since between the ethics training and an employee engagement survey, which most companies have a high response rate to, you will get a sampling of data from people you may not that may be so far below the radar that you're not even aware that they exist until there's a problem.
And Beatrice, your points actually highlight something that came through as a comment, which I think makes a lot of sense. And that is, in the world of corporate governance or even just law, the only thing worse than not having a policy or having a statement or a procedure is to have one and then not have the wherewithal, the commitment, or the resources to follow through, right? And so I think certainly, Ray, that was implied in what you're saying. And Beatrice, you're outlining the fact that you have to really dedicate time, effort, and resources to make these policies and other strategies truly manifest, which I think should not go without saying. So thank you for saying it. That's helpful. And maybe Holden and Bill, can you bring some of your perspective? I know you've both had some obvious, you don't think of them as best practices, minimalist practices around HR. You also have some strategies around how to really reframe this as something you're doing for employees instead of thinking of them as the as the risk source. Like that is in part the reality, but there's a better framing, which I think is important, especially in Silicon Valley culture. Like employees are the lifeblood, like they make all the difference. And if we start saying, gosh, let me see which one of you is the worst risk, it doesn't sound like that goes over real well, right? So maybe expand on that for us.
Sure. So I think that I mentioned it a little bit before, but this kind of turning it on its head, there's a number of sort of programs that mostly have come out of the government kind of talk about insider threat. And again, as I mentioned before, I think it just sounds incredibly insidious, and it's not really the right way to think about it, right? Because for one, it sort of purports that everyone who is in here was a threat when they entered your company, right? Rather than they were put into a vulnerable position and may have became a problem later. So we really like to think about it and turning on its head and think of it that these people are in a vulnerable position, right? Either because of connections or because of access to information that a nation state or someone else may want, right? And there's also another piece of the program, I think, that is a bit backwards, that as Bill mentioned, the insider threat program, it catches someone after they've already done wrongdoing. What you really want to do is something preventative. You want to make it easier for employees to do the right thing, right? And so that will cover 80–90% of your situations. And then maybe you have something that captures those who still, despite being educated and despite being told about the concerns of it, to still go down a dark path. But the majority of the program really needs to be on how do you capture or catch these people before they kind of go off the cliff, right? Before they put into a position where they have someone who's being put in their, back in their home country, or someone that's here in the United States, but they're being put under duress, and how to keep that. I think the main way to do this is to have a thoughtful idea about an employee security program. Someone looking at how do you protect your employees, right? They're, again, simultaneously your greatest vulnerability and your greatest asset. And they really need to be thought of separately from kind of the traditional cybersecurity and the traditional physical security. It really is a third iteration in some ways. And in our eyes, it's really the most important part. They contain your information, your ideas, they're your brand, they're the face, literally, of your company in many ways. And it's unfortunate there really isn't a program that's focused on how do you keep them safe from all the people outside of your company who may want to do them harm.
Great. Bill, did you want to add anything to that? I'm going to run a poll about whether people are kind of already doing this in just a second, but I thought I'd let you jump in.
Yeah, no, thank you for asking. And just super quickly, the only thing I'd add to what Holden said there is the idea that if I want to protect this population, arguably vulnerable population, I need to inform them. I need to well inform them. And first of all, you can think of some of the young whiz kids, what have you. Have they been told that what they know or what they have access to would be of great interest to some people who might be up to no good? Have they been told they're a potential target? It sounds like a very basic thing, but I don't think it happens enough.
Yeah, and I would throw out that in preparing for this session, I read about and learned about some of these stories are really kind of heartbreaking, right? Like you have really good people, extraordinarily talented, have worked hard to rise up in the ranks inside an organization, often aren't at the tippy top, by the way, which I'm sure is a strategic matter, right? But, and then their family maybe back home in a hostile nation state or somehow is used as leverage against them. And then the story, I read that in the intelligence community, people are starting to read Robert Cialdini's book, Influence, which is like one of my favorite books, which I make people read in corporate governance, which is about the ways in which good people can kind of incrementally end up down a path of decision-making that is actually quite negative. And so like, it doesn't have to be a bad person story. It can be a valuable employee, good person, and forces sometimes beyond our average thinking operating quite sophisticatedly to make bad outcomes. So with that in mind, I want to run the poll, Nancy, if you could, just to see if this is on radar screens or if people are doing this. So again, it's just a question about your company's HR department or the equivalent if this policy lives somewhere else, about one of the examples that Holden and Bill both highlighted, which is this notion of safe harbor reporting and assistance. Like if you find out that your cousin, your sister, your parents, your grandparents are being threatened and you've been asked to do something that seems not too bad, but it's one of the bad actors, is there a policy that you can rely on to go and report this, get help? Is that on the radar screen? So yes or no, or you may not know. So you could guess, probably not, maybe, or not sure at all. So let's see what people think in terms of these kinds of policies. All right, so a quarter yes, which I take that as a really good sign. A little less than a quarter no, probably not. I think that's fair. Like I wouldn't have known immediately, even though I'm chair of the Federal Home Loan Bank. And then not sure at all. Okay, so I think there's a lot of room for boards to investigate. That's a great board function, which is to ask this question and to see what the management recommendation is in this regard. So we have a bunch of questions that are popping up. I want to encourage people to submit questions. I want to change gears to that. We've got about 15 minutes left. Let me ask maybe a question that came in very early, which is, and I think we have some people who spent time in the intelligence community based on some of the questions that are coming in. One question is, this organizational effort across industries where different industry groups, whether through the government coordinating, which sometimes happens, I know with the FBI, I have examples from the cybersecurity space, but sometimes without necessarily the government, helping or coordinating, they share information. They try to keep each other informed about emerging trends and threats. Like, can you comment on that as a strategy and maybe the trends in that regard, maybe some best practices? One person referred to it as kind of the corporate neighborhood watch program for information security, intelligence intrusion. So I like that phrase. So maybe Holden or Bill, do you mind if you go first to talk a little bit about that?
I'm happy to add a couple thoughts real quick. So I think there are some, I'm not aware of any comprehensive programs that are out there. I've seen some ad hoc examples where companies will trade and share information, but I think it's a great idea. Just to play off of one of the examples that Bill gave, if I recall correctly, the individual in the Coca-Cola example, she actually left Coke and went to another place and was essentially another company. I've forgotten the company, I believe it was in Tennessee. But she was then pilfering information from them as well and sending them back to be used for other types of companies as well. So if that information, Coke already had some suspicions when she left that there were some issues because she had been, one of the problems is she was actually told that she was going to be let go and then took the information subsequent to that. If they had shared that, they could have prevented it from happening to other companies. And so I think it's a great idea, but I have not seen it in terms of an actual comprehensive program. It's mostly ad hoc sharing.
Great.
I couldn't be more supportive of those ideas. Ray had said it on the outset here. Information is the lifeblood of everything we do today. That includes in the risk and threat space. And so if companies are going to be transparent there, that they'll only get stronger in those areas as a result.
And I just proved Beatrice, go ahead, Beatrice.
Yeah, you start crossing over into matters of law that could get you into very hot water. As we all know, when you fire somebody and somebody later calls you for a reference, your best response is to not answer the call. And at the very best to say, yes, he was employed here, he or she was employed here. So this notion of, communities of companies sharing information about individuals, I think could get you into ginormous class action suits and legal issues. So I cannot imagine any company with a legal department being willing to engage in those kinds of activities. So hate to pop the bubble. But
No, it's a great point. I probably have the obligatory, point to make, which is whenever you're deviating from your pre-existing policy, go grab your general counsel and or consult outside counsel. It's just the world we live in. You do need to be cautious. Although I perused our list of attendees today, and we've got some, as is often the case with these webinars and SVDX, we've got some real heavy hitters. People who are high achieving in positions of prominence. It strikes me that there can be some methodology crafted for a sort of collegial neighborhood watch strategy, which may or may not go down the path that Beatrice indicated. I agree with you, but something could be done. And so let me ask some related questions that also have come in. I'm kind of working backwards. So universities, near and dear to my heart, of course, are a very open environment by design. That's half the reason they work so well. And more than a decade ago, there was kind of a funny anecdote where a couple of us associate deans discovered online, it was called Stanford in China. And it was actually just a series of videotaped available online. There was a paywall, of course, of classes at Stanford. And we realized we have such an open environment that someone had been going around and just filming like hot classes and just posting them online and charging people money to look at them. So kind of outright IP theft. It was a little funny. It got fixed, but it's not surprising that kind of thing can happen. The question is, how do you deal with that culture and insert the strategies and caution that you've discussed? Like those two things don't seem to go easily together. And I assume it applies within the bubble of an Apple campus, a Google campus. Like these are collegial open environments within reason. So how do you strike that balance? Are there some strategies you've seen that work or some approaches?
Dan, if I could take first shot at that. Real quickly, I think it's really important for universities to make clear what is acceptable and what is not acceptable type of activities, in effect on campus or in research conditions. And so from what I understand, a lot of universities do have some policy governing again, what's allowed and what's not allowed, but rarely are they actually bringing in students when they're to remind them of what the policies say and making it very clear. You can do this and you can't do that. It's to Ray's point, because then if they deviate, there's more things you can do in response. But again, making that very clear. The other thing I'd mention is, again, just the idea of what assets there are you most trying to protect from a university standpoint? Which people, because of what they know, or which particular sensitive research, what have you. And then to me, those have to be treated differently than just the complete, open and collegial sharing environment that most engage in.
And the good news is that sounds like consistent with the best practices we outlined, which is invest time in training, create policies, have clarity, have follow-up and support. I'm going to skip around to a couple other questions. Someone asked pointedly, should there be concerns about proprietary, they said software, but let's assume any sensitive proprietary information, stored in the cloud, whether it's Amazon Web Services or otherwise. Like what's the level of concern there, and how does a board maybe think about talking about its policies in that regard?
Well, I'll jump in there. My thesis after Target, and I studied it quite a lot, wrote a book in 2018 about it. You have to assume the bad guys are in, whether it's physically or cyberly, and you've got to have policies and procedures and training to identify it when it happens, whether it's some intrusion detection software on an endpoint or whatever. So is it safe? I don't know. Is it important to you that it be very safe? That I would rethink what you do with your data and where you put it.
Any other, thanks, Ray. Any other thoughts?
So there are multiple ways of insulating against cloud provider. First of all, is make sure your cloud provider has adequate protections. I mean, previous company I ran, our customers were government agencies. And so they required, all of our the employees that even touched their data or went near something that might touch their data had to have security clearances and so on. And so we were initially not hosted in a public cloud, but we made an arrangement with the vendor that said you have to have these restrictions in terms of running in its own virtual machine, in terms of having physically isolated, hardware in a locked room, and your employees that go into that room have to be security cleared. And they were willing to sign up to it because there was a lot of revenue for them. This was still early days. So I think you can take measures to protect against you, but if you're going for the cheapest possible rate in Amazon or Azure, that is not going to get you the level of security that you need.
Holden, it sounded like you had something to throw in.
Yeah, I mean, the SolarWinds is just a great example of that, right? I mean, this is sort of the change from targeting individual companies. The Russians have been really kind of prolific in trying to find those nodes, right? So they did penetrate the Microsoft Azure cloud software. So think of it like this: if you have a limited number of resources, and you could attack 20 companies separately, or you could go after a cloud service and get potentially the data on thousands, if not tens of thousands of companies, right? So they are an extremely lucrative target. They may be more difficult, but is it exponentially more difficult than going after particular companies? So I mean, I think in many ways they have a lot of the same kind of condition or concerning issues. And then getting back to our sort of theme today, there's obviously the cyber venue or avenue in, but there's lots of humans that are working in these places, right? And sometimes they're not always in the United States. It's not always in locations that are well regulated or even well monitored. And so I think there is some concerning sort of patterns of where this data is located, and it might be actually even easier at times to get at it than it would be to go after the individual companies, which would take monumental resources.
Yeah, let me parse that into a couple of takeaways for everyone. I think that was very well said. So one, a best practice and strategy in all security, but we tend to talk about in cybersecurity, is identify your levels of risk. What's important to protect, what's very important, what's critical, what poses an existential risk if it is compromised, and parse those and then invest accordingly, right? You don't have to put everything all in one place under one method. And then I think, and based on another question that came out and building on what you just pointed out, Holden, the compromises tend to be hybrid, right? So you don't just see a cyber compromise, you see an insider plus cyber, you see kind of kinetic on the ground activity, et cetera. In fact, the big government breach, the OPM, Office of Personnel Management, was not just cyber, it was a compromise on the ground. And we got a question which I'll throw out for you, and that is a couple points. One was, isn't it still disgruntled insiders more than compromised individuals? But even more, how do you prepare and train around this idea of social engineering? And I will point out that in preparation for this, I read a very disconcerting analysis that identified the possibility that click-through spear phishing attempts that are successful may sometimes be compromised individuals' cover for cooperating, which it was obvious the moment I read it, but as soon as I read it, I was like, oh dear. So let me ask both those questions. How do you do this balance of disgruntled versus, nation state compromising someone? It sounds very cloak and dagger once again. And then what do you do about this training around social engineering and just awareness about it? Any kind of, again, maybe focusing on senior management and board level appropriate actions, questions, activities. What can we do in those regards? Holden, you look like you have a thought.
Sure.
And then I know Ray does.
I don't want to talk over.
You guys are too polite.
Yeah, sure. And so, I mean, I think the stories that come out about a disgruntled employee, I think they're particularly salacious a lot of times. And so those are the ones that often get reported. A compromised employee, if you think about it, in some ways, you've got two individuals who are sort of satisfied, right? And so it's like in many ways, corruption, where you have people on both sides of the story. The only people who are hurt are sort of indirectly kind of the public, and they don't have access to the information. But I don't think it's often a combination of all these things. Like, you'll find someone who's disgruntled, so it may be easier to kind of socially engineer them and push them to a place of where they're happy to do this, right? Or where they think it's a possibility that they're going to get away from this. And so, no, I don't think there's plenty of examples in my mind. They may just not have all kind of made it out into the open press, where individuals have been compromised because of things that are going on in their life. and again, the line between being compromised and disgruntled sometimes is a little bit opaque, right? They have a lot of difficult things going on in their life, and they may be just upset in general, and that's a great time. Intelligence services, this is what we're trained to do. We take that and we move someone down the path very slowly to a place that they didn't want to go, and they're very, very good at this. So kind of then switching to the idea of spear phishing, you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the easiest ways to really kind of get into a place is to do the hybrid operation, right? And you get someone at a potentially, you know, you can just be a administrator, you know, not even an IT administrator, but someone, you know, a secretary, and say, hey, well, you get a alumni email from your, you know, your university every month. We're going to send you one next month. Make sure you click on it. It's going to look exactly the same, and we'll pay you $50,000. And when they come to you and say, what happened? You say, well, I get this every month. I get this, and I always click on it. And you just, you know, say that it was, I've been compromised, or I've essentially been socially engineered, right? So that's a really easy way to both cover up for the employee themselves, potentially, if they're put into a position or somehow bribed into doing something. And so I think that it's always going to be this kind of back and forth between someone who's a bit of the, you know, cyber, as well as a bit of using the human side of it. The only way to do this, I think, is kind of a layered approach of educating people so they know and prepared for this, and make it clear to them that you have multiple ways of finding this, you know, kind of out, and so that there will be consequences to this, and so they feel like there's both a carrot and a stick in terms of having the kind of proper policies in place for the company to go forward.
Great. There's a couple other questions which we'll provide afterwards, and we have people's contact information. Maybe if you want, you can send an answer. We got one, you know, that's along the lines of, once you see some bad actor behavior, but it's not quite fully manifest, when do you intervene? Can you preemptively do stuff? These are all great questions, but I'm sensitive to the fact that we have to end in 2 minutes or 3 minutes here. I want to ask our final question, which we mentioned before, and that is, if you encourage people who are paying attention today, either they're on a board or they are an executive, to think about one thing or do one thing, what would it be? Beatrice, since I know you teach class any moment now, I'm going to let you go first in case you have to hop off.
Thanks. Yeah, I would have just two points that people can do immediately. One is review as a board member, the company's insurance policies. Do they cover cyber? Do they cover employee exposures? I mean, that is a very basic thing to do. With many companies haven't looked at their insurance coverage, or they made the decision, oh, it's too expensive, et cetera. So as a director, you owe it to the company to ask for that information. And the other is ask for, how is the company doing their annual reviews of employee engagement? What are the specific questions? And make sure that you think in those questions that they are asking things that will elicit responses that would potentially point to a hidden risk. And third, make sure they're following good enterprise risk management across all of these areas, human capital and so on. That's my
great. That's great. Thank you. I'm going to have Bill, Holden, and then Ray's going to go last. Bill, do you have what one to do or one to think about or two?
Sure. So I was reading this morning about the congressional hearings on the January 6th riot at the Capitol, and there seems to be some disagreement. But it appears the FBI is saying, "Hey, we provided a memo to U.S. Capitol Police the day before about at least part aspect of the gravity of the threat." The U.S. Capitol Police former leader said, "Hey, that never made it to me and my leadership team." As we talk about risks and threats and all, it all comes down to in managing risk and threat information. And so I'd ask anybody who sits on a board, does your organization have an effective process to collect, analyze, and share risk and threat information in a timely manner so that the people who need it can make decisions when they need to make them?
That's great, Bill. Thank you. Holden?
Sure. And something I mentioned before, we talked about, I think, having a robust employee security program, thinking about how to protect your employees. And I think you could even, it doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a separate head of security. You know, and at the end of the day, a CISO is a chief information security officer, not a chief, you know, IT or computer or cybersecurity, you know, security officer. It's about protecting information, right? So that information is contained in people, it's contained in IT systems. Think about both of these and make sure that you're protecting them in all the different avenues.
That's great. Ray, you're going to get last word.
Okay, it is the last word, drill. So all those policies, all those actions, all that training, you should run drills. You should practice, even to the point of hiring an actor. Bring them in, let them do some bad things, see if people observe it. If you've really got sensitive stuff and really great products you want to protect, you might want to take these kinds of precautions. Sadly, it's true, but you need to do that. Drill.
Appreciate that very much. Well, we are out of time. This has been very informative. Appreciate very much the panelists' expertise and willingness to spend time with us today. And of course, everyone who joined as well. And thanks for attending SVDX events. I think there's a Q&A question right afterwards in terms of suggestions or ideas for future approach to this type of topic. And I just want to again, thank the panelists and thank Nancy. Have a great day.